Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode. Today, we're going to be discussing 3D resin printing for just about anybody. And I know it said noobs, but technically, I just mean people who are new to 3D resin printing. So, for those of you who have no idea what you're doing and you want to learn pretty much how do I do this, where do I get my files, what do I do when I get the files, like what's the process of all that, this is probably the best episode for you because it's going to give you a good kickstart in that direction. It's even going to touch on the concept of slicing and how that works and stuff like that. So, anyway, stay tuned. This episode is pretty much aimed at everybody, but for anybody who's really new to it, this is going to be a really good episode for those of you who have no idea what you're doing. This is going to hopefully teach you how to get started. All right, let's go. All right, so as we're talking about different types of resin printers that there are, there's really three distinct types of resin printers. But while there may be more varied types of these different, variants themselves, these are going to be the three basic types you're going to interface with in the world around you. The first one of those is going to be laser SLA, or standard, that's laser stereolithography. And this works pretty much like the original stereolithography laser 3D printers worked back in the day when they were first created. The difference is you'll find that some of these use lasers from underneath, or some of them actually have a laser system that works from above, which is kind of far out. But I've seen both. The older ones are different than the newer ones, and you tend to find different versions of this as you do the research. If you are interested, Matter Hackers sells a system, I believe it's called the MOI, that uses a laser SLA platform that makes some very decent prints from what I understand. So this is one type of SLA or resin printing that you're going to find. It is not the only type of resin printing, but it is similar to your MSLA or DLP SLA style printers that use a laser or light to cure the resin. In this case, it's a laser. In other cases, it's going to be light. So, again, these aren't the most common, and they're usually on the pricier side, whereas, your MSLA systems and your DLP are going to be much cheaper. The second type we're going to talk about is DLP SLA, and that's selective exposure to light by projector. That's essentially a projection of whatever the image is supposed to be projected onto the platform area, the build area, whereas the laser was a pinpoint, kind of like a very accurate target, whereas the DLP SLA works in a whole layer, and you get that effect of a projected image, which can be very high resolution if it is a very high resolution projector. So that can work really well if that is if it's made well and if that's what you're going to use. And also, you're mostly limited on space. DLP printers are commonly very small. The biggest one I think I've interfaced with is a little over 6 inches as far as the width on the build plate. They're very small. So you're not working with a lot of space. These aren't big, but the detail levels are going to be greater. They're also going to be a little bit more expensive to maintain, but you're going to get more work hours out of them, meaning that you're going to get more time out of this than you would out of an LCD screen with an MSLA printer. A laser printer or a laser SLA printer will last you longer, probably more like 20,000 hours. A DLP will last you about 20 to 25,000 hours, whereas an MSLA will usually last you between 2,000, maybe if you're lucky, double that, 4,000 hours, like some of my machines have just lasted me forever. It really all depends on how well you take care of them too. So that makes a big difference. The last type of SLA is the MSLA, which is going to be your most common. It's also going to be your most inexpensive. This is a masked LCD, and essentially what it is it's the light is blocked from all the other areas except for where the two-dimensional slice is going to take play in the piece, and that's going to be your major difference. So MSLA is usually the most inexpensive because of that. And what you have is you have a cheap LCD screen, you have a cheap light source, and then you have this cheap material for the FEP and all that stuff. It doesn't need to be super expensive or high tech, just needs to be able to work. And so MSLA printers are usually the most common on consumer side. probably going to be your first resin printer is going to be an MSLA. If you go for much else, aside from that, DLP is also highly recommended. They're, like I said, more expensive but longer life hour. So you're going to get 20 times the life expectancy, and it's not 20 times the cost. So, I mean, if your choice is between an Ultra and, a 4K2, go with the Ultra. You're going to get more life out of it. And the results are going to be nicer at the end of the day. Sure, DLP has its own little shortcomings in here and there, but for the most part, it's pretty good. Like I said, MSLA is going to be one of your cheaper alternatives. These are your, I'm going to call them the throwaway machines. They're disposable. You can use them, burn them out, and throw them away. Some of them aren't even worth replacing screens because the cost of the screen is about as much as you could pay for a used one. So again, this is where this is probably where you're going to start, but not where you're going to stay. Anyway, moving on to how you're actually going to go about getting prints. So there's this site called Thangs, there's Thingiverse, there's Cults, there's My Mini Factory, there's tons of places. You're going to come here, you're going to Thangs, you're going to become a member, sign up, use your Google account, whatever. Then you're going to look up all kinds of print. Now, if you're an FDM guy, you're going to find all these articulated weird stuff. You're going to find all kinds of things there. If you're like me, you're going to go flop over to stuff like the Printed Obsession, who's one of our partner artists. Love these guys. And you're probably going to download something cool like a Pokemon. If you're more into fantasy stuff, you're going to head over to My Mini Factory. You're probably going to want to become a member of one of their tribes so you get stuff every single month. It's actually a really good deal if you are into D&D, Pathfinder, stuff like that. It gives you a lot of resources to use consistently, and I think that's important to be able to have that. And the cost isn't too crazy. If you join the tribes, usually you get a decent amount of content every month for not too high of a price, and you stay. I think you even get choices in voting in most of the cases, so you get to kind of pick what comes up and what doesn't. But check all of those sites out for yourself and see what works best. Lots of places have free alternatives to downloading prints where you can go and download some of the artist stuff for free, kind of like a free sample, and that lets you kind of decide whether or not you want to use any of those artist sculpts in your 3D printing time. Because remember, this is all time sync for you, and it's kind of important to choose that. So once you got your file, once you've downloaded it and you're ready to start going, you're going to want to bring it into your computer and open it up with a program called 3D Builder. And this is free if you're on Windows, if you're on a Mac or Apple computer. I don't know what you're going to use. There might be an alternative, but 3D Builder is great. Import the file. Make sure it doesn't have any errors. It'll tell you in the lower right-hand corner. If it doesn't, you can then kind of like orient it however you want. Get a good look at it. You can scale it. You can change the way it's, do like the direction, like up and down. You can flip it, flop it, rotate it. And then once you're done, just click the save button to save the file to make sure that it writes the file back to the computer. The reason I use 3D Builder is because 3D Builder will catch far more errors on print files than most of the other applications that I use to do slicing. And I work with LYCHEE Slicer like 99.9% of the time, but 3D Builder just catches errors and fixes them. It just fixes them, and then it's good. You're done. Boom. After that, you want to go ahead and get into your slicing software, which we're going to cover in just a moment. Okay, so as I said, you're going to need to have a slicer software. And you're probably thinking, what the heck is a slicer software? So I'll put a couple of links in the description of this video of different slicers that you can download. My biggest recommendation is always on LYCHEE Slicer because it has the most user-friendly tools, and it seems to have it has a very good setup for people who are new to 3D applications. The controls are easy to use and very manageable to someone who's not familiar or comfortable with it. Here I have loaded up the Bidoof Pokemon character model in a couple different sizes. And some of these are hollow, which I'll get into in a minute, what hollowing will do. And the difference, obviously, is that these have hollowing cavities and these don't. But then you need to worry about something called holes. Again, we'll get into that in a moment. So when you're in your slicer, your file is going to come into the slicer, and it's going to be solid. You know, you're not going to have hollowing and stuff unless the object was hollow to begin with. So let me just make a duplicate of him real quick. So this is our standard. This is our little model. This is a Pokemon. Bidoof. And he's solid. Little solid chunk, but he's solid. Oh no, actually this one's hollow. Hold on, let me delete the hollowing. So you can delete the hollowing. It's actually not that difficult. You just select the object and go to hollowing. Delete. All right. So anyway, like I said, you import the object and they're solid. He's a little chunky piece. Like as far as like width is, chunk. When I say chunk, I mean like a chunk of resin. And because of that, I would still recommend hollowing him. Maybe not this size is fully necessary. I probably would anyway, just to save material. We'll get into that in a minute. So you'd have this piece, and you'd have to come in here to your prepare area, and you'd have to create your supports. Now, most folks would probably just go with like, okay, this is heavy, gonna go manual, like auto supporting, and then we'll just, make it like, I don't know, normal or, we'll say normal. So just boop. And this is what you wind up with. Now, I'm not saying this is wrong or this wouldn't support the model, because it might. You'd have to do some other things like check to make sure your islands are supported. And you're probably thinking, what is an island? Okay, great. That's a perfect question. This is a good place to start on how to learn how to do this. So an island is any part of a print that starts without something else starting next to it or as a part of it. As you can see, there are some parts of this object that start on their own, like out here, and those parts are islands. So in order to make sure that they're fully supported the way they should be, you want to use this little slider here as you go up and down and make sure that they are as you kind of scroll up and down through the print slices. And you can view it from this angle, or you can view it from this angle just by using your mouse and scrolling around by holding and clicking on the right mouse button. Now, you can also alternatively add things called rafts. Rafts work like this by creating unions of points or shapes to allow the print to have some higher level of adhesion to the build plate itself. This gives it more stability. And it does work. I highly recommend rafting your objects. But back to your supporting, if you're going solid like this, you're going to want to make sure and check for islands by going over to the island section of your support tab and then having it search. And yes, depending on the size of the object, height of the object, usually this can take some time. Now, often people ask me how often or how much should you check for islands? In this case, I only found one. What in the world? Oh, strange. So we'll go ahead and support that. And then usually what I'll tell folks is you should go and do something like this, where you have, okay, take your resin settings, prepare them at 3 different sets of layer heights. Go from 20, 35, and 50. And I'll explain this in a minute because you're probably thinking, but you haven't explained that yet. So here we go. So before you get in all this, we'll back up a bit and we'll get back into here. When you choose a slicer, you're going to need to do something called a resin profile. So the resin profile in LYCHEE Slicer is located in the lower left corner. Here you simply click down where the printer is, and then you can load your printer by clicking on it. In this case, we're using the Anycubic Photon X2. And I'm using a profile that has 50, 35, and 20 micron print settings. And you can edit them by clicking the edit button. Now, if you didn't have a profile on the particular printer, or if you were just using a default, it would look like this, where you're either using the official or the default. And some printers work pretty well in the official settings, but I often just try to dial in my own settings that work for me. As far as resin settings and profile settings, usually try to set them towards manufacturer specifications. That is, of course, if you're using manufacturer resin, which I highly recommend doing because it tends to work the best. So again, when you check your islands, by using that island search feature, you're going to want to switch between these layer heights in order to check at different layer heights. We'll go back to our Prepare tab and search again. And you'll see here it'll find more islands at the different layer height. Not too bad, actually, considering. But it's a very rounded object, so it really shouldn't have too many islands, and it didn't get hit. Yeah, so here we go, 0. And then we can go to 35. And we found one more. Down there. Now we're going to switch back to the resolution we're printing out, which is 50. Do what we call a proximity check, which is this tab here. And then we can go back to our manual tab. And the only thing I would recommend at this point is to make sure that you support your perimeter of every one of these shapes. So it doesn't have to be the heaviest support you're using. And yes, my settings are going to be in the description. You want to just support the area around each particular object. And usually the perimeter is the most important part. We have a couple different episodes when it comes to supporting by shape and by perimeter style. So be sure to check those out if you are new. And just make sure you get around the belly area. Perimeter is important because the perimeter will support the interior. All right, there we go. Then you can go ahead and do your auto bracings by clicking that button. I'll connect all those bracings together. And that should give you some pretty good support on that piece. Now, if you did want to do what I was talking about before, which is hollowing, I can explain that a little bit more in detail. So, like I said, the objects do come in solid and they look like this. But when you hollow them and you apply a raft and all that fun stuff, see, then you can then go here and you can update that and that'll make it hollow. So now you have this big empty cavity in the middle instead of having all that material being used. See, like this one, that has a lot of material, whereas this one does not. So you're saving on material, and you can save on support style too. But you do need to do something called drain holes. So drain holes are done by applying to the areas at the bottom. So you're going to take holes. In this case, these are too small. About like 2 millimeters at the minimum. And we're going to put those in the bottom, like where the feet are, where this point is here. And some of these areas are a little too small, but obviously nothing's going to fit there. So what I need to do is we need to see which part of the model is going to come up first. So there, here, and there you go. So now you have a decent amount of holes. You can use this object detector, which is like a suction cup detector down here, and that will tell you, okay, you have some suction here and here. So we need to figure out how to drain that, and probably that too. That'd be okay. Put that at the bottom. And then I'll show you. There you go. Then you're good. So now you got to do is remember that these places where you have holes, you'll just have to fill them later when you go through to finish and paint your model. So you punch those holes out, and there you go. And now once again, you can go back to your supporting, and you can support this object. And repeat the same process we just did with the other piece by going through the island process and everything else. But now your object is going to be far lighter because it is now hollow. So I hope that helps explain the difference between those two types, because that's how that works. Now, when your object's really large, it's much easier to create the holes and such because you have a lot more room to work with. Like here, I mean, look how much more space I have to work with when you're talking about big objects. So you have a lot more space to put all these drain holes in. And it works out a lot better because when the object's too small, even if it's wide or something and it has like a wide surface area, putting a bunch of drain holes is just you won't have the room for it. You saw what just happened there, so it's not as easy as just putting them where you want. Sometimes it won't let you. Sometimes it'll cut a hole in the wrong place. So you still want to make sure you have enough drain holes. Because if you don't, you create too much suction. I'll explain that. So where you don't have a hole, it's like when you put a cup into another body of water, it's going to create a vacuum when it goes down. So when you go to pull it back up, it's going to be much harder. So when you hollow something, you create a cup. And so it needs to be able to come back up with less force. So the drain holes allow it to do that. Once you're done doing your support work and you have everything the way you want it, like this little guy. Now, I haven't gone crazy and checked him, but he's pretty much he's done. Like he's been auto supported, He's got a decent amount of heavier tips on him. He's got a raft. He's got all of his islands covered. I'll go ahead and we'll just export him. And I'll show you what a slice looks like. So I'll also explain some of these settings here because everyone always asks what the anti-alias stuff is. So if we choose nothing, you get no aliasing on the edge of the pixel. Aliasing is something that tries to clean up the edge of the pixel by creating gray levels between the pixels to make them look a little smoother. So it takes a hard edge, like a peak, like a step, and it creates a circle, by smoothing out the edges between them. So off does nothing. It offers no assistance whatsoever in between the pixels. Sharpen or smooth or any of these other ones will add and contrast different levels of gray. Smooth is the one I prefer to use now, which I usually go with 2 pixels and about 30% to 50% on the gray radius or gray offset. And I use high definition aliasing to try and increase the level of the quality of each slice. This will give you a very smooth print, especially for something like this. It's got a lot of smooth edges. And if you're doing something more like a mini, like a D&D mini, you're going to probably want to use sharpen and just choose the highest aliasing that your printer will support. For us, we would go with a 4, and I would raise this to 30%. And then if you're going with contrast blur, which is another type of aliasing, you would go with 2 pixels and 30% or 50%. And then once you have the settings that you want, you go ahead and export those slices. So once you get your file all sliced up and put onto your USB drive, probably something like this, please don't use the ones they give you with the printer. Go on Amazon or go to your local PC store and buy yourself a couple good flash drives. That actually, these are pretty decent. These are PNYs. The ones you usually get with the printers themselves are no names. I don't usually see any that have any name branding on them, and they normally don't last very long. If you want to get one that you can tell what's going on, if you want to make sure the print's okay, you can get some of the ones that have lights on them that'll flicker when they're working. Those are always neat, unless, of course, the printers are anywhere near you when you're trying to sleep, but I don't recommend sleeping around your printer. Just saying. It's probably not a good idea. Anyway, that pretty much covers the most of the basics. I didn't really explain what a slicer was, so I'll kind of close up with that. So for those who are completely new, a slicer is a piece of software you are going to need in order to slice your print. And slicing is cutting the object into 2-dimensional cuts in order to allow you to print it. So it is vital to actually do this in order to put your print into a 2-dimensional sense so that way you can print it. That is pretty much it for the basics. I'm going to put a couple of links in this as well to some other videos that we have on our channel that would probably be beneficial for anybody that is new to the 3D printing world. Good luck to you out there. For those of you that are just getting started, I hope this gave you a little bit of a kickstart in your journey in 3D printing. See you all soon.